I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. On this episode, the battle over the Indian Act's second-generation cutoff.
The determination of a solution here at this table, and then asking me to go and consult community, when this solution is driven from a group that is not of Indigenous descent, that does not realize the impact of second gen, is racism itself. I'm sorry, I will not proceed with that. Indigenous people know what solutions are for themselves.
That was the Minister for Indigenous Services Canada, Mandy Golmasti, appearing before the Senate's Indigenous Affairs Committee on November 6th. The hour-long meeting between senators and the minister was contentious, and you might even say a little heated at times. The Senate was, at the time, studying a government-sponsored bill officially called an Act to Amend the Indian Act, and in brackets, New Registration Entitlements. The Senate committee sparked a fierce debate when it introduced an amendment to discard what is known as the second-generation cutoff in the Indian Act. The cutoff, which was introduced in 1985, prevents parents from passing on Indian status after 2 consecutive generations of parents who do not have status. Now, this amendment replaces the cutoff with the one-parent rule, allowing anyone with status under the Indian Act to pass their legal identity and rights onto their children. While the Act to Amend the Indian Act is on its way to the House of Commons, there's a lot of talk about the fact and fiction in the information being shared. Pam Palmater is a lawyer and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation and the chair of Indigenous governance at Toronto Metropolitan University. And she says that she and her family will be personally affected by the outcome of this proposed legislation, and she joins me now to share more. Pam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you wrote to the Senate about S2, and I'm going to quote you here. I am registered because of the persistence of my family. Can you tell us what you meant by that?
Well, when I was a child, my grandmother and my father, who had grown up on the reserve and spoke their language and all that, got impacted by the Indian Act. And you know, all of the historical provisions, which if you married a non-native person, the woman lost their status and so did all of their kids. And because of Sandra Lovelace, now Sandra Lovelace Nicholas, former senator, taking Canada to the UN and winning her case, my grandmother and dad got their status back, but it still cut us off. But men, like her male relatives, all their kids had status. So Sharon McIver had to fight that, which is how I got in, and then, so on and so on and so on. And so my family made it their mission. Like, I have 8 sisters and 4 brothers, and most of them were older than me, growing up in the, 70s, so very politically active. We're like, the most significant thing we can do is push for recognition because it impacts other things like our treaties, our right to vote in, banned elections, our right to participate in negotiating self-government agreements and things like that. It's really the first step. So that's kind of how I got into it, not by choice or particular passion, but because my family was just so immersed in it.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us some examples of how people are losing status right now?
Yeah, so there's still many, many problems. People misunderstood that when the Act was amended in 1985, famously known as Bill C-31, and women got their status back, that would be okay. But instead, that only gave their kids half status. That's why the 2010 amendments with Bill C-3 made sure their kids got status, but the grandkids didn't. But the male grandkids still had status. So the sex discrimination and race discrimination kept continuing amongst the generations. So there is still no sex equality in Indian registration. You've got the issue of enfranchisement, where people were voluntarily or involuntarily enfranchised, lost their status, who had to go to court and win their case. this is what this new bill S2 is about. But then you have all of these women. A secondary issue is for women only, First Nation women only, who married Native men. They were forced to become members of their husbands' First Nations. And only happened to women, sex discrimination, and they've had no right to go back to their homes, whether they were divorced or anything that happened. So this is part of the changes that are required. And then this whole second generation cutoff, people think that it's gender neutral because it doesn't say man or woman, and that the second generation cutoff just applies equally, but it actually doesn't. It applies generations earlier to women and their descendants than it does to men and their descendants. So there's still sex discrimination in the Indian Act that we're fighting very hard to get rid of, which is different than losing status. So in the old days, there was a multitude of ways to lose. Nowadays, you can't lose it. It's just you might not have it because of all the sex discrimination that's been carried forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, moving to S2, how will the proposed second generation cutoff amendment impact you and your family?
It'll impact me and thousands of others in very significant ways because right now, approximately 5% of the population that live on reserve are the non-status Indian kids and grandkids of people that live on reserve. So they don't get funding from the federal government. They're not included in per capita calculations and things like that. So the bands have to subsidize this. So the lack of recognition for their kids and grandkids that are cut off because of this second generation impacts the bands as well as it does individuals. If these amendments are passed, and they've made it past the committee, they have to go to the Senate, full Senate today, it means my grandkids would be in. Now, my grandkids are not disconnected. They have been born right into the Mi'kmaq culture, my community, my massive family. We're all intermarried with other Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey families. So it's not like we're saying, there is an ancestor from 500 years ago, and that person is going to claim to be status. No, these amendments only look forward. So when the second generation cutoff was included in 1985, it's only been in place for the last 40 years. So it would only be talking about kids and grandkids at this point right now who have been impacted by second generation cutoff, people who either live on reserve or are very connected to their families. It's a very different issue. And so it would mean my grandkids could be officially recognized, and well, they should be.
Kind of going a bit deeper into this bill, what do you make of Minister Mandigal Masti saying that consultation is needed for it?
Yeah, so that was very enraging to me, to be honest. And I told the committee and senators this was very enraging because how dare she come to committee and say consultations have to happen? Consultations on this issue have been happening for 40 years. We have no less than 4 major reports that have resulted from consultations saying, from the majority of First Nations across the country and First Nation organizations, get rid of this second generation cutoff. It leads to our legislative extinction. So because they don't want to deal with it, because they want to maintain this legislative extinction, she's like, oh, we have to consult. So this is a circumstance where they are weaponizing consultation. They're using it as an excuse to justify ongoing delays. And that's very problematic when you think about that means it's not charter compliant. And they are upholding non-charter compliant legislation. And here's the thing about consultation. I'm a proponent of consultation. I am always arguing that Canada has the duty to consult, accommodate, and get consent. Now that we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, yes, there has to be free, prior, and informed consent. However, what the minister failed to mention is that it was this level government who sued the Mikisew Cree Nation, who fought them in court to argue that they don't have a legal duty to consult when they're enacting legislation. And they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada agreed and said there is no duty to consult when enacting legislation. So she forgets all about the fact that they fought really hard, that there's no duty to consult. But when it comes to women's rights in First Nations, all of a sudden, no, 40 years of consultations is not enough. We have to have another round of consultations. And that also ignores the fact that at committee, you had the Assembly of First Nations, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Southern Chiefs, you've had First Nation organizations that represent all of the First Nations in this country say, get rid of the second generation cutoff. You had all of the women litigants come and say, get rid of the second generation cutoff. And she says, no, we have to do consultation, but don't worry, we're going to have standalone legislation in the coming months. That again is very enraging because she failed to be honest to the committee and say, listen, the cabinet has not issued an order for standalone legislation to deal with second generation cutoff. Because there is no cabinet order, that means that legislation could be 2 or 3 years into the future. It is not in the coming months. And so it's really all of this kind of game playing and political tactics that is really hurtful to the rest of us, because consultations have happened. All of the witnesses represented all of the First Nations, but maybe one or two. And they all want second generation cutoff and sex discrimination entirely removed. And the Senate committee is like, well, we can't really argue with that because it violates the Charter, Section 15, sex and race equality, violates UNDRIP, because everything in UNDRIP has to be guaranteed equally between male and female people, violates Section 35 rights, including the right to self-government, because Section 35 rights are conditional on everything being equal between male and female people. I mean, there's just no way to get out of it. And here they are trying to say, oh, but consultation. And, I might add, this is the exact same thing that they did with the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society case at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal chastise the federal government for constantly using weaponizing consultation as a means to justify delay. And they said, rightly so, that you have to get rid of the discrimination. You can consult on a whole bunch of other things. And we're saying you should consult on how much housing each First Nation needs, how much infrastructure, extra money for education and health. Consult on those things. But you can never consult on whether or not to violate the charter rights of First Nations, which every First Nation in this country has.
What do you think are the underlying reasons that the government is hesitant, even after 40 years of discussions, as you say, about not ending this discriminatory practice?
Well, keep in mind what the original underlying Indian policy was, right? It was to get rid of the Indian problem until there's not a single Indian left in Canada. And they've talked about this. The whole reason why there is a second generation cutoff, because there never used to be. But the only reason why that was added in 1985, think about it, it's because Sandra Lovelace won her case at the UN. And so they had to amend the Indian Act to bring all of these First Nation women back, right? So they're adding more status Indians. So they had to think, well, that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to get rid of the Indian problem. So let's just create out of thin air this kind of fictional blood quantum ideology where after 2 generations, there's no more status Indians. And then they could calculate with high precision the extinction date, the legislative extinction date of every single First Nation in this country. That exists. I wrote my doctorate on it. And imagine for them to stand and try to defend that while saying they're committed to truth and reconciliation, while saying that they're committed to the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Women and Girls, while they're committed to the principles from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, while they're committed to the Charter. Those things don't go together. And here's what I think it is. Because the Parliamentary Budget Officer for the last set of amendments with Bill S3 in 2017, and it was going to increase the population, The federal government was saying, oh, millions will be added. Look, First Nations, you don't want these amendments. Millions will be added. Your bands will be overwhelmed. You'll all go bankrupt. You can't do this. This will hurt you. So it was this fear mongering. So the parliamentary budget officer did an independent analysis of the statistics, the facts, and said, in fact, it's nowhere near millions. At most, it was going to be 250,000, but probably far less, because think of all the people who pass away, the shorter lifespans that we have, people who don't apply. And he said, even if it was 250,000, at the end of the day, the vast majority of those people already live off reserve. They're not going back to the reserve. So there's no net increase or financial burden to First Nations at all. And if you look at the financial issues for Indian Affairs, that is primarily for on-reserve services. So it's not going to hurt First Nations, and it's certainly not going to hurt for the federal government. So you're thinking, okay, but why? Surely they can't be attached to this whole Indian policy about no more Indians. But here's why they are. It's less about money and more about the power and the land. We still have a say. We are the only impediment, the only barrier or shield to unfettered extraction, land ownership, development, sales to foreign countries. We're the only thing that stands in the way because we have constitutionally protected rights. However, their jurisdiction only extends to Indians. And if they can find a way to make Indians extinct, they have removed that political and legal barrier to everything they want to do with our lands, our reserve lands and our traditional lands. And they removed our voice because they wouldn't have to recognize us anymore. And think about the treaties, right? The treaties, they've always had this policy, unless you're a status Indian, you don't get treaty benefits. Well, what's an easier way to get rid of treaties than to get rid of the treaty beneficiaries? So it's always about power and access to our lands and resources, not about any cost, because even the parliamentary budget officer said it's a minute increase at best for programs and services. The majority won't even use them. So then you have to think, okay, well, what about the millions and millions? What about First Nations who are saying, but wait, we can't handle 100,000 new members in our community, and they don't have to worry about that, because assuming these amendments pass, that means roughly 20,000, if everyone applied and no one died, it would be roughly 20,000 people in the next year and a half. Divide that, though, by 634 First Nations. You're talking about 30 people per First Nation. Now, obviously, that has to be adjusted for population, but that's not overwhelming. Some First Nations have more babies born every year than that. So we're talking about tiny chunks. And so nothing about what they say is fact-based. It's all fear-mongering. And I think the reason why they keep consulting on this issue in particular is because they keep hoping for a different answer from First Nations. They keep hoping that First Nations will be the ones to discriminate on the basis of sex or race against their own people. And so far, that hasn't been the case. We have near unanimous support to stop this legislative extinction.
So I want to move to an opinion piece that you wrote in Policy Options about this. And in it, you're asking for 3 changes. Can you kind of go over what they are and what the impact of them would be?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of very detailed things that you have to do when you're changing legislation, because you don't want to have unintended consequences or mess up other sections. So there's little tiny things that have to be done. But in general, what we were asking for and what the Senate committee passed by a 10-1 vote was remove the second generation cutoff. And what does that mean? It means effectively you move to a 1-parent rule instead of a 2-parent rule. And that's the way it is for citizenship for the majority of countries around the world. We're effectively self-governing and should be even more self-governing. The analogy is like another state. So get rid of the second generation cutoff, which removes the two-parent rule and institutes a one-parent rule. And we think that that will be the most foundational and impactful thing they should do. I think the other thing they need to do, and the thing that doesn't really get a lot of attention, is every time they've amended the Indian Act to end a tiny portion of the discrimination, they put in a section that says, oh, and by the way, you can't sue the government for any discrimination that we had against you. They're trying to insulate themselves from liability. In every single bill, including the previous one, S3 and C3, and in S2. So we said you need to vote that out, and which is what they did. And so the government now is going to First Nations saying you should be very concerned about removing this insulation from liability because we're also insulating you from liability, which is, again, not factual or legally accurate because there is only one entity that determines Indian status, and that's the federal government. So only the federal government can be liable. The bands can't be liable for who's a status Indian. They have no say over that. The bands have a say over is band membership if they choose to develop their own code. And the majority of bands in this country have not developed their own codes for this very reason, because of all of the historic and ongoing current discrimination and all of the federal liability that's attached to that. They want Canada to fix its mess before they assume membership. You can also control citizenship under self-government agreements. That's a smaller number of First Nations. So these are the things that are the most critically important. There's other things I would like to have seen them do, but this is the biggest chunk. This stops the legislative extinction. If you get rid of that second generation cutoff and move to a one-parent rule, First Nations get to live forever. And we think that's what it should be. And they shouldn't be able to insulate themselves from liability because even the Supreme Court of Canada has said, while the government is immune from liability for governing decisions they make in good faith, that's not an absolute rule. And if they act in bad faith or knowing that there's discrimination, then they can be held liable. So we're saying you need to stop that. Stop trying to insulate yourselves. If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to protect yourself from.
Mm-hmm. And so every time it seems the government proposes a bill to amend the Indian Act and gender-based discrimination, it does so because it's been ordered to by the courts. And I'm wondering, why hasn't the second generation cutoff gone through the justice system?
So that's a very complex question. These cases. So if you think about, Jeanette Corbière-Laval and Yvonne Bedard, who, tried to pursue their case decades ago, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Think of how much money that costs. Same with Sandra Lovelace, how much money that costs. And then Cher McIver, who won her case, had to fight in the trial, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court of Canada, and go all the way to the UN. That's decades of your life and money, and same with Deschanel and same with Ling Gill. And now there's Jeremy Mattson. And so Jeremy Mattson won his case at the UN quite recently that talks about all of this, everything I've talked about is discrimination, and they need to get rid of this two-parent rule and arbitrary cutoff dates because they have this 1985 arbitrary cutoff date. That's one of the other things we want them to remove. And so we win in every single forum. And Canada, every time it makes a tiny amendment, it says, look, just let us make this tiny amendment now to deal with this tiny piece, and we will hold consultations right away, and then we will amend the act in the future based on these consultations. Those are bold-faced lies. They never do that. Never have the Indian status rules in the Indian Act ever been amended, ever, after a series of consultations. It's only when the courts force them to every single time. And so that's why when they're saying, look, just let these S2 S2 go ahead and just wait for consultations, and then we'll have legislation in the future. We know that's a lie. We know they're not going to do that. And not all of us have money to fight in court. So we have to do it in these kinds of ways at Senate committees and House committees. And, it's very interesting to understand that. So we know second generation is a violation. I mean, you just talk to or read any of the UN cases. But the fact that they want us to wait for what? In other words, they're saying, take us to court. Take us to court, and then maybe we will. But here's the thing. So they've played this game so long that now the courts are saying, wait a second, stop making these people go to court. In the last case that resulted in amendments in Bill S3 in 2017, that came from the Deschanel case out of Quebec. And the Quebec court, Madam Justice Mass, said, listen, not only do you have to fix all of this discrimination that's in this particular fact scenario, but you need to look at all of the discrimination in Indian status and remedy it. Stop limiting your amendments to just one fact scenario and allowing the rest of the discrimination to continue. So it's not like they haven't been told by the courts to stop doing this piecemeal approach. But see, if you set aside the power dynamic and the fact that they want our lands and resources, think about what the benefit they get by delaying. I have argued that it's unjust enrichment. So if you say, look, we're going to wait for consultations, and then consultations never results in legislation, and then there's another election, and then, it goes on and on and on. For every day that all of these kids and grandkids aren't registered and they don't get the benefit of Jordan's Principle, health services, housing, any of the kinds of critical social programs and supports, that's another dime saved by the federal government. And so they use that money to put towards other things. So they're literally taking money from our women and kids and putting it to put billions in the military or into all of these projects they're going to deem in the national interest in C5, the One Economy Act, which, I'm on a rant here, but which brings to mind C5 to begin with. Did you hear any of the ministers, including the Minister of Indigenous Services, Crown Indigenous Relations, or Northern Affairs, say, wait a second, we can't push C5 ahead about, declaring all of these projects, extractive industries in the national interest, because we have to consult with First Nations and we have to develop a consultation plan, and this is going to unravel over the next year. And then no, they didn't. They're like, we don't have a legal obligation to consult, and they didn't. They rammed that through. They haven't consulted on any of the legislation that negatively impacts our rights. So consultation's not even on their minds. But when it comes to the rights only for First Nations women and kids, all of a sudden, 40 years of talking isn't enough. Now we're going to have to do 50 years of talking, which really brings home the point from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, that it's always Indigenous women and kids that are at the bottom of the priority list. Who cares if they're going murdered and missing, being subject to severe violence, abuse, exploitation, disappearances? What matters is everything else. And this epic battle, this fight against our women, and it's always our women that have to fight this, they will throw up any excuse to not end sex discrimination against First Nation women, despite the fact that they were told by the National Inquiry to do so. They were told by the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba to do so. They were told by the Status of Women. They were told by multiple, at least 10 UN reports and decisions to do so. They continue to do it. And I think it's because they know they can.
So Pam, you end your policy options opinion piece by writing, "Reconciliation cannot wait another generation. My grandchildren deserve justice now." And I'm wondering, what does justice look like? And do you think your grandchildren will get justice?
Oh, they'll get justice. I guarantee you at the end of the day, they will get justice because First Nation women are powerhouse warriors. They will never stop. They're all mama bears who will keep fighting until their kids are protected and get justice and the land and the water is protected. So I have every faith that they will ultimately get justice, but they shouldn't have to wait decades because there's irreparable harm that's done. And interestingly enough, even the minister acknowledged this and the federal government acknowledged this in their litigation. It does irreparable harm to their sense of identity, sense of belonging, to their relationships with their extended family members, with their communities, with their larger nation, their sense of self, their security in that. And kids have a right to be able to enjoy their identity and culture with their nations. And so you can't undo that. My kids are going to forever be impacted and have that horrible sense of insecurity because they weren't included from the day they were born. They were only included when they were older. So they knew they were born into being excluded. And my grandkids are just babies. They don't know this yet because they take part in all of our powwows and ceremonies and communities. And so I don't want them to have this. And then there's all the, economic things that they won't have the benefit of, things like Jordan's principle for special needs and health issues. There's just so many things. And for some of us, it's the end of the family line. And we cannot live in a country that says, yeah, we're okay with the end of the family line. I know I'm not. What would I rather be doing? I'd rather be working with my First Nation and the Mi'kmaq Nation, developing laws and policies and, pursuing this fulsome kind of self-determining, sovereign self-governance for our nation and our nations. That's what I would rather be doing. But Canada forces only Indigenous women to be in this epic forever battle to protect our kids, whether it's kids at the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, Human Rights Tribunal, protecting them from discrimination in child and family services, protecting them from lack of housing, protecting them from lack of water, protecting them from societal violence, state violence. And here, this is another form. If you think about residential schools, they took the kids away from the parents. Forced sterilizations. You're preventing our women from having kids. You think about 60 Scoop and the foster care system, taking kids away, constantly separating Indigenous women from their kids. And that's what this Indian status is all about. And if you look at all of the historical documents, it is about this. It's about severing the ties of First Nations women and kids from their communities in the hopes that these communities just die off. And I guarantee you there will be no First Nation woman that allows that to happen.
Pam, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Stryker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.